Mr. Milligan expressed his intention to call upon William Goodell, editor of an anti-slavery paper, confidently expecting on his way home from synod to, quote, make him a covenanter, unquote. I also heard soon after that he honored Steele with the appellation of a, quote, pro-slavery man in heart, unquote, as his senior son more publicly and recently attempted to revive the contemporary one of drunkard, simply because he never did nor ever would join an abolition, temperance, or any other organization for moral reform outside of God's ordinances. At this meeting, Messrs. Sloan and Roney submitted their respective papers for the argumentative part of the original plan of Reformation principles exhibited. Synod so far expressed its approbation of the Brethren's diligence as to order the publication of the two papers in overture. And that was the last of them, so far as the Synod was concerned. And here a footnote. Let these two papers on the power of the civil magistrate and the Arminian controversy be added to Mr. Archibald Johnston's piece, Messiah's Headship, to which he prefixed the Latin title, Regnum Lapidus. Let these three papers be combined as a sample of the argumentative part of the projector's plan, and it is presumed that any judicious person will perceive the absurdity of the original plan. Why had the plan been executed according to the specimens above noticed? By this time they would have filled several folio volumes. Is this the plan of the Church's judicial testimony? At this meeting, a monthly magazine was projected, not as Synod's organ, although Mr. M. Roney was appointed editor. With the following spring appeared the Reformed Presbyterian. I subscribed for it and aided in its circulation until its partisan course became manifest. It refused to hear both sides. Individual contributions and even presbyterial proceedings were refused a place in its pages. I paid all dues and, in a lengthy letter to the editor, assigned some reasons for discontinuance. Of this letter I kept a copy, anticipating possible prosecution for libel. This, however, was not attempted on that ground. The Western Subordinate Synod met at Brush Creek in the fall of 1837. Little business of public interest was transacted at this time, except the final disposal of a complicated case which had for some time troubled the brethren within the bounds of the Ohio Presbytery. Mr. Armour McFarland, probationer, had accepted a call from the congregation of Utica, Licking County, Ohio, and I was appointed chairman of a commission to ordain and install the candidate. In his trial sermon he taught, and with much confidence labored to prove, that repentance precedes faith. Among various ways of statement by the young man, I took down in writing the following, quote, some degree of true, sometimes he used genuine, repentance necessarily precedes believing the gospel for salvation, unquote. A majority of the commission considered this doctrine unsound. The members dealt with the candidate in the presence and hearing of a large audience, but could not prevail to change his position. Reverend J.B. Johnston, the same one who had been the first commission to Walnut Ridge, suggested that the young man might feel more free in private than before the congregation. The suggestion was unanimously embodied in a resolution to adjourn and meet at the house of one of the elders. After partaking of refreshments, the members of commission in an extrajudicial and most free manner resumed the conference with Mr. McFarland. Mr. Johnson, who affected to sympathize most with the candidate, was allowed to propound most of the questions with a view to mutual understanding. Although the conference was continued till midnight, no agreement was effected. Before separating at the meeting house, I saw the candidate contemptuously throw his certificate of licensure on the floor. Some said he trampled on it, but I do not believe this. The commission, unable to proceed, referred the case to the Ohio Presbytery for advice. When this court met, Mr. Lusk, now for the first time hearing of the difficulty, made light of the matter. Quote, the young man hath not sufficiently studied the subject. He thought that in a brief interview he could easily convince him of his error. Unquote. Accordingly, a committee was appointed with Mr. Lusk chairman, and a recess was had, allowing time for conference with Mr. McFarland. On the court coming to order, the chairman said, quote, Moderator, your committee can report no otherwise than as reported by your commission. Unquote. What legal steps could be further taken in this case? The young man persisted in his error, and had treated the presbytery with contempt in casting away his certificate. He was, of course, suspended. This, for the time, was no cause of serious concern to the young man, for he could find congenial employment by lecturing among the abolitionists, and, by doing so, express his deeper contempt of the presbytery. About this time, I assisted Reverend Robert Wallace at a dispensation of the Lord's Supper. He told me of dissension among his people growing out of the anti-slavery excitement. He mentioned one prominent member, George Stewart, with whom he desired me to have no intercourse. On the fast day evening, as we were about to separate, Mr. Stewart invited me to lodge with him. I assented, against the remonstrance and incurring the displeasure of the pastor. After supper, Mr. S. entered upon his grievances. He said in substance, quote, "For a long time we have got no preaching, but abolition, abolition. Nothing but abolition every Sabbath. We are all abolitionists, and many in congregation are as tired of this soul-starving gospel as I am. We want you to come and preach to us, that we may get anti-slavery teaching and something more," unquote, etc. Mr. Stewart was a man of sanguine temperament and generous disposition. He would listen to friendly counsel. I showed him the illegality and dangerous consequences of my, quote, "intruding on another man's line of things," unquote. And besides the irregularity of my interference, his proposition would be impracticable at a distance of 130 miles. This interview put a stop to Mr. Stewart's divisive intentions, and I heard no more of him or his troubles. Before the meeting of the subordinate synod, Mr. Johnston, here a footnote, this is the gentleman who had been on the first commission in Mr. Lusk's case, whose partiality at the previous meeting of the subordinate synod had called forth Mr. Blackwood's indignant and scathing rebuke, and who afterwards left the body. In his letters to the Pittsburgh Brethren, he had represented the commission at Utica as having removed Mr. McFarland from the public to a private house, quote, "to murder him in the dark," unquote, the very course himself had proposed. Mr. Johnson had by letters biased the minds of the ministers of Pittsburgh Presbytery in favor of Mr. McFarland. He boasted that he had an array of men, especially of elders, who would strike terror to the hearts of the Ohio Presbytery. But though members of that presbytery were not at all terrified, they were amazed and grieved by the high-handed measures of synod. It was known to all concerned that for error and contumacy Mr. McFarland had been laid under suspension by the Ohio Presbytery, that he had continued in an attitude of open rebellion, treating the authority of that court by word and act with the utmost contempt. And here a footnote. This man afterwards lost the balance of his intellect, and in his melancholy musings on the past was heard to say, quote, "Oh, Mr. Steele was right when he said I was not fit for the ministry," unquote. The poor man, I learn, is still alive, and for many years useless among his brethren, and a pitiable wreck of humanity. When his case came up in the subordinate synod, a succession of illegal acts crowded on each other. The Ohio Presbytery was divided without just cause. The Lakes Presbytery was organized within the jurisdiction of the Ohio Presbytery. And finally, Mr. McFarland was ordained by the new presbytery with the concurrence of members of Pittsburgh Presbytery without removing the suspension. While these outrages were in progress, Reverend John Crozier of Pittsburgh Presbytery lodged with me, and in sight of the meeting house. I asked him if he was going over to the ordination. He replied that he would have nothing to do with the disorderly proceedings. Reverend Thomas Sproul attended, but was reported as hesitating to cooperate. When the moderator invited all ministerial brethren present to join in the imposition of hands, Mr. Sproul remained in a distant part of the assembly. The moderator paused and reiterated the invitation. At length, with an apology, that only to prevent farther confusion, he cooperated in the action of laying on of hands on the candidate. Thus terminated the tragico-comedy, long afterwards vulgarly called, quote, "the McFarland scrape," unquote. At next meeting of this synod, Mr. J.B. Johnson, as clerk of the recently and disorderly erected Lakes Presbytery, reported, quote, that the Reverend Armour McFarland had been regularly ordained by said presbytery and is now entitled to a seat in synod, unquote. As clerk of the Ohio Presbytery, I publicly announced, quote, that Mr. McFarland had not been regularly ordained, unquote. Mr. Sproul arose to express his astonishment at Mr. Steele's statement. Did I not lay my hands on the head of the candidate? This was, of course, readily admitted as true, but did not make the ordination regular. This act of a profane farce was ended by an order of synod, quote, that the Presbytery of the Lakes report to synod at next meeting the steps taken in the ordination of Mr. McFarland, unquote. Of these disorderly steps, synod never heard.